A millionaire ridiculed a waitress in front of his wealthy friends, expecting her to stay silent. What she did next shocked everyone in the room. The restaurant was a world of its own, a gilded sanctuary where the hum of conversation mixed with the soft clinking of crystal glassware and the occasional laughter of Manhattan's elite. Ethan Kane, a man whose name alone could open doors and close deals, leaned back in his chair at the head of a long table. He held a glass of Bordeaux in his hand, swirling the deep red liquid as though it were a token of his success. Around him, his entourage of friends, investors, heirs, and those who clung to wealth like moths to a flame, hung on his every word, their laughter spilling over like the bubbles in their champagne flutes. Ethan's suit was as immaculate as his reputation, tailored to perfection to accentuate his sharp jawline and broad shoulders. His emerald green eyes flicked across the room, observing everything, including the people who worked there, with the same detached amusement he reserved for boardrooms and parties. He thrived on power, and tonight was no exception. Can you believe this? Ethan chuckled, setting his glass down with deliberate flair. A $500 bottle of wine, and the pour is barely enough to rinse your mouth. That's the world we live in. Paying too much for too little. The table erupted into sycophantic laughter. Across the room, Claire Matthews adjusted the tray balanced on her hand, her posture erect, her steps measured. As a waitress in one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York City, she had long since mastered the art of blending into the background while remaining vigilant. Tonight, however, the hum of self-satisfaction emanating from Ethan's table made her stomach churn. It wasn't the first time she had seen his type. Men who wore their wealth like armor, who believed money placed them above reproach. But Claire wasn't the type to cower under wealth's glare. She approached Ethan's table with her head high, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. The tray she carried held plates adorned with dishes that looked more like art than food, each one a carefully curated masterpiece of excess. Ethan turned his gaze to her as she arrived. "Ah, finally, the artist herself," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, meet the genius behind tonight's masterpiece of plate carrying." The laughter came fast and loud. Claire set the first plate down without a word, her face an impassive mask. She had been on the receiving end of mockery before. The dining elite often mistook uniforms for invisibility, but Ethan's tone carried a sharper edge, one meant to entertain his audience at her expense. "And what's your name?" Ethan asked, leaning forward with feigned interest, his grin sharp and predatory. "Claire," she replied evenly, placing another dish in front of one of his friends. Her voice was calm, measured, as though she hadn't noticed his bait. "Well, Claire," Ethan continued, drawing her name out as if it were a joke in itself, "tell me, do you ever get tired of walking around carrying other people's dreams?" One of his friends, a man whose name Claire neither knew nor cared to know, chuckled. "You mean they're leftovers?" The table erupted again. Claire paused for a fraction of a second, her tray balanced in one hand, before she turned her gaze to Ethan. Her expression didn't falter, but her eyes locked with his, steady and unwavering. "Dreams are funny things," she said softly, her words deliberate. "They can change faster than you think. One day, you might find yourself working for someone who used to carry trays." Her tone was calm, her expression unreadable, but the words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The laughter quieted, the ripple of discomfort spreading across the table. Ethan's smile froze, his fingers tightening around the stem of his glass. For a moment, he looked like he might respond, but Claire didn't give him the chance. She straightened and continued to serve the rest of the table, her poise unbroken. When she turned to leave, Ethan leaned back in his chair, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to him. "Touché," he said, raising his glass in mock salute. "Well played, Claire." As she walked away, he found his gaze lingering on her, watching the precise way she moved between tables, her head held high. There was something about her, something that irked him. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't playing the role he expected her to play. "She's got some nerve," one of his friends muttered, breaking the silence. Ethan shrugged, but his mind was already churning. "It's nothing," he said, his tone dismissive, though his eyes flicked toward the kitchen door where Claire had disappeared. Just a little show. People like her love the attention. Yet, as the evening wore on, Ethan found his focus drifting. While his friends debated the merits of yachts versus private jets, he kept glancing toward the restaurant floor. Every time Claire passed, she seemed utterly unfazed, as if their interaction had been a mere footnote to her night. It grated on him in a way he didn't fully understand. By the time his party prepared to leave, Ethan was itching for a final word. As his friends filed out, he lingered behind, pretending to check his phone as Claire cleared the now empty table. She moved with quiet efficiency, stacking plates and glasses with a precision that spoke of years of practice. When she reached for the wine glass near his seat, Ethan spoke. "You're quite the conversationalist," he said, his voice low, almost playful. Claire paused, her hand hovering over the glass. She glanced at him, her expression polite but distant. "Just doing my job. That's the funny thing," Ethan said, leaning forward. "You don't seem like the type to just do the job." Claire picked up the glass and set it carefully on her tray. "Appearances can be deceiving," she replied, her tone neutral but laced with something Ethan couldn't quite place. Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, her steps measured, unhurried. Ethan watched her go, his fingers tapping against the table. For the first time in years, someone had left him without the last word. Outside, the crisp night air bit at his skin as he joined his friends by the waiting line of luxury cars. The hum of engines and the chatter of his companions faded into the background as Ethan's mind replayed the evening's events. Claire's parting words echoed in his head, tugging at a thread of curiosity he couldn't shake. "You're quiet," one of his friends said, glancing at him as he slid into the back seat of his town car. Ethan smirked, though his thoughts were elsewhere. "Just thinking," he replied, staring out at the glittering city skyline. "Something about tonight caught my attention." In the restaurant, Claire stood by the kitchen, her tray now empty. She let out a small breath, her calm facade slipping for just a moment. Her fingers grazed the edge of her apron, her thoughts momentarily elsewhere. Then, with a faint smile, she picked up another tray and stepped back onto the floor. "What about you? If you were in Claire's shoes, how would you handle someone like Ethan? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more captivating tales like this. Your support means everything." The next morning, Ethan Kane's penthouse gleamed under the New York sunlight. Perched on the 50th floor, the sprawling space was a study in excess. Marble floors that reflected the city's skyline, glass walls that blurred the line between indoors and out, and furniture so pristine it looked untouched. Ethan sat at the edge of his leather sofa, his laptop open on the coffee table in front of him. Despite the luxury around him, his thoughts were fixated on the waitress from the previous night. Claire Matthews. The name lingered in his mind like an unfinished puzzle. She wasn't the first person to challenge him. He'd faced rivals in boardrooms, competitors in deals, but she was different. She didn't seem to want anything from him, and that was what gnawed at his ego. Most people either envied or desired something Ethan had, but Claire had stood in front of him like an immovable force, unmoved by his wealth or arrogance. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. Picking it up, he saw the name of his oldest friend, Marcus Reed, flashing across the screen. Marcus was one of the few people who had been with Ethan before he became the Ethan Kane, a man defined by power and opulence. "Morning, Marcus," Ethan greeted, leaning back into the couch. "Morning? Try afternoon," Marcus said with a laugh. "Late night?" Ethan chuckled, though his tone was distracted. "Something like that. What's up?" "I was calling to see if you're still on for the gala next weekend," Marcus said, his voice casual before pausing. "And to ask what's got you so quiet." "That's not like you." Ethan hesitated. "Just something from last night. Nothing serious." "Ah," Marcus said knowingly. "Someone caught your attention?" Ethan smirked, though Marcus couldn't see it. "You could say that. A waitress at the restaurant we were at last night, Claire. She had an attitude." Marcus laughed. "An attitude? You mean she wasn't falling over herself to impress you?" "Exactly." Ethan's smirk faded as he stared out the window. She's different, and I don't like loose ends. Careful, Ethan, Marcus warned, though his tone remained light. Chasing a loose end can lead to a knot you can't untangle. Ethan ended the call shortly after, but Marcus's words stuck with him. He wasn't chasing Claire. He didn't need to. He simply wanted to understand why she hadn't played by the rules, why her words had stuck with him long after the laughter at his table had faded. To Ethan, people were predictable, easily swayed by charm or intimidation. Claire, however, was an anomaly. At the same time, in a modest apartment across the city, Claire Matthews stood at her small kitchen counter, brewing a pot of coffee. The space was nothing like the restaurant she worked in. Its worn countertops and chipped cabinets were a stark contrast to the pristine world of her shifts. But it was hers, and it was enough. As she poured her coffee, her mind replayed the events of the previous night. Ethan Kane's smug face, his probing questions, the way his entourage had laughed as though their wealth made them untouchable. Claire had dealt with wealthy patrons before, but Ethan had been particularly irksome. His confidence wasn't just irritating, it was suffocating. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced at it to see a text from her friend Sarah, a fellow waitress at the restaurant. "Sarah, you okay after last night?" Heard Kane was a real piece of work. Claire smirked as she typed her reply. "Claire, nothing I couldn't handle. Just another rich guy who thinks the world bends for him." But as she sent the message, she couldn't ignore the faint unease that lingered. Ethan's questions had been invasive, and his gaze had felt too sharp, like he was searching for something beneath her surface. Claire had worked hard to keep her past buried, to blend into the background and avoid attention. She couldn't afford to let someone like Ethan dig too deep. Later that day, Ethan returned to the restaurant. He told himself it was a coincidence, that he was simply in the mood for their food again. But as he stepped through the heavy glass doors, his gaze scanned the floor for Claire. She was there, of course, moving between tables with the same grace and composure she'd shown the night before. Ethan took a seat in her section, his presence commanding attention even before he spoke. Claire approached his table, her expression neutral. "Good evening, Mr. Kane. Back so soon?" "I missed the ambience," Ethan said smoothly, though his smirk gave him away. "And I thought I'd get better service tonight. Maybe even a smile." Claire tilted her head slightly, her lips twitching into a polite, practiced smile. "I'll do my best," she said, her tone even. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You know, Claire, you intrigue me." Her expression didn't falter. "I'm sure you meet plenty of intriguing people, Mr. Kane." "None like you," he replied. "You're different." She didn't respond immediately, instead setting down the glass of water she'd brought him. "Different how?" "You're not impressed by me," Ethan said, his voice laced with both amusement and annoyance. "Most people at least pretend to be." Claire straightened, her calm gaze meeting his. "Why would I be? You're just a man at a table, Mr. Kane. A table, I might add, that's the same size as any other." The corner of Ethan's mouth twitched upward. She was good, he had to admit, but her defiance only made him more determined to crack her composure. That night, as Ethan sat in his penthouse, he opened his laptop and searched her name. The results were sparse, almost frustratingly so. A few social media accounts, locked and inactive. A LinkedIn page that listed her as a college graduate, though the details were vague. Ethan frowned, leaning back in his chair. He was used to uncovering people's stories with ease. Everyone left a trail, photos, articles, connections. But Claire was like a blank slate, and the lack of information only deepened his curiosity. Meanwhile, across the city, Claire sat in her apartment, a book open in her lap but her thoughts elsewhere. She had seen the look in Ethan's eyes when he'd left the restaurant, and she knew it wasn't the last time she'd see him. He wasn't the type to let things go, and his interest in her wasn't casual. She had to be careful. Men like Ethan Kane didn't ask questions unless they wanted something, and Claire couldn't risk letting him find the answers. As the city lights flickered outside her window, Claire let out a slow breath. She'd chosen her path carefully, knowing it would cross with people like Ethan eventually. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly he'd zero in on her, or how much she'd need to stay one step ahead. The game was beginning, but Claire was ready. She had played it before. Ethan Kane prided himself on his ability to read people. In business, it was a skill that had catapulted him to the top. He could spot weakness, predict desires, and leverage vulnerabilities with the precision of a surgeon. But Claire Matthews defied all his expectations. Every encounter with her was like trying to decipher a code written in invisible ink. She gave him just enough to keep him intrigued, but not enough to crack the mystery of who she really was. 2 nights after their last meeting, Ethan found himself seated at the same table in the restaurant. The maitre d' raised an eyebrow when Ethan insisted on being in Claire's section again, but said nothing. Ethan had learned long ago that money often muted questions. When Claire approached his table, her expression was calm, though her sharp eyes betrayed an awareness of his game. "Back again, Mr. Kane?" she asked, setting a glass of water in front of him. "You're becoming a regular." Ethan smirked, leaning back in his chair. "I've developed a taste for the atmosphere. Though I have to say, it's the service that keeps me coming back." Claire's lips twitched, though whether it was the start of a smile or a subtle expression of disdain, Ethan couldn't tell. "I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant to be," Ethan said smoothly. He studied her as she adjusted the place setting, her movements practiced but unhurried. "Tell me, Claire, how long have you been working here?" "Long enough," she replied without looking at him. "And before this?" Ethan pressed. "What did you do?" Claire met his gaze then, her expression impassive. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Ethan said with a shrug. "You don't strike me as someone who blends into the background. I'd bet you've done more interesting things than this." "Appearances can be deceiving," Claire said, echoing the words she'd used during their first meeting. "Would you like to place an order, or should we continue the small talk?" Ethan chuckled, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "All right, you win. I'll have the special." As Claire turned to leave, Ethan couldn't help but admire her composure. She was like a fortress, impenetrable, unyielding. But fortresses had weaknesses, and Ethan was determined to find hers. The following week, Ethan began to gather information. His curiosity had turned into an obsession. He didn't just want to know who Claire was, he needed to. Her lack of a digital footprint was unusual in an age where people documented their lives online. It only made her more intriguing. "I want everything," Ethan told his private investigator, a man named Robert who had worked for him on several occasions. "Her past jobs, her family, her education, anything you can find." Robert raised an eyebrow. "You're usually not this invested in waitresses, Kane. What's so special about this one?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Ethan said, his tone curt. "Just do your job." A week later, Robert returned with a slim file. "This is all I could find," he said, dropping it onto Ethan's desk. Ethan opened the file, his brow furrowing as he scanned its contents. Claire Matthews had attended a prestigious university but dropped out halfway through her program. There were no records of why. She'd worked at a few odd jobs before landing at the restaurant, but none of it explained the sharpness in her demeanor or the confidence she carried like armor. "Anything unusual?" Ethan asked. Robert hesitated. "Not on the surface. But if you want my opinion, she's hiding something. People don't vanish from institutions like that without a reason." Ethan stared at the file, frustration bubbling beneath his cool exterior. Claire had managed to create an enigma of herself, and it only made him more determined to unravel it. Meanwhile, Claire was well aware of Ethan's growing interest. She could feel his eyes on her every time he came to the restaurant, could sense the weight of his curiosity pressing against her like an invisible force. But she wasn't rattled. If anything, she found his efforts amusing. Men like Ethan were used to controlling the narrative, to bending the world to their will. Claire was content to let him try. One evening, as Ethan dined alone, Claire approached his table with the check. She placed it down gently, her eyes meeting his with deliberate calm. "Something tells me this isn't about the food," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Ethan raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "What makes you say that?" Claire tilted her head slightly. "You've been coming here every night for the past week. Either you're in love with the risotto, or you're looking for something else." Ethan chuckled, leaning forward. "And if I said it was the company?" Claire didn't flinch. "Then I'd say you're wasting your time." Ethan's smile widened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Admiration, perhaps, or frustration. "You don't make things easy, do you?" "Why should I?" Claire replied, her tone light but firm. "Life's more interesting when you earn what you want." Ethan watched her as she turned and walked away, his mind racing. There was something about her, a quiet strength that made her stand out in a room full of people trying to blend in. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was playing a game where the rules weren't entirely his own. Over the next few days, Ethan found himself analyzing every detail of their interactions. He replayed her words in his mind, dissected her expressions, tried to anticipate her next move. It wasn't just about solving the puzzle anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could. Claire, for her part, remained unbothered. She went about her shifts with the same quiet efficiency, her interactions with Ethan no different from those with any other customer. But beneath her calm exterior, she was calculating. She knew Ethan wouldn't stop digging, and she was prepared for what came next. One evening, as Ethan paid his bill, he noticed a small card slip from Claire's apron pocket. She picked it up quickly, but not before Ethan caught a glimpse of the name printed on it. Matthews Foundation? He didn't say anything, but his curiosity burned brighter. The next day, Ethan asked Robert to look into the Matthews Foundation. The name wasn't familiar, and a quick search revealed nothing significant. But something about the way Claire had reacted to the card told him it mattered. "She's playing her own game," Ethan muttered to himself as he stared out the window of his penthouse. But two can play. Ethan Kane rarely hosted events without a purpose. Lavish gatherings at his penthouse weren't just about networking. They were about solidifying his place at the top. Invitations to his soirees were coveted. They signaled inclusion in his world of power and influence. This time, however, Ethan had a specific agenda beyond flaunting his wealth. Claire Matthews. It had been 2 weeks since Ethan's interest in Claire had evolved from idle curiosity to something bordering on obsession. The Matthews Foundation, the card she had dropped, turned out to be a small, obscure organization supporting workers displaced by corporate takeovers. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. He had made his fortune by outmaneuvering weaker companies, leaving countless lives upended in the process. And yet, the connection between Claire and this foundation felt too deliberate to ignore. The gala was Ethan's move to draw her into his domain, to see if she would fold under the weight of his world. He had pulled strings to ensure Claire was assigned as part of the waitstaff for the event, curious to see how she would navigate a room filled with people who embodied everything he represented. Claire adjusted the white cuffs of her uniform as she entered the penthouse that evening. She had served at high-profile events before, but stepping into Ethan Kane's domain carried a different weight. The penthouse was even more ostentatious than she had imagined, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city below. The air buzzed with the sound of crystal glasses clinking and conversations tinged with arrogance. As she wove through the crowd, balancing a tray of hors d'oeuvres, Claire could feel Ethan's eyes on her. He stood near the bar, his tailored suit impeccable, a glass of scotch in hand. His smirk was faint but unmistakable, a predator watching its prey. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan's voice carried over the hum of the crowd as he stepped forward. "Let me thank you all for coming tonight. It's always a pleasure to gather with such distinguished company." Claire paused near a corner, careful to remain out of direct view but close enough to observe. Ethan was in his element, commanding the room with the ease of someone who had never known failure. But as his gaze swept the room, it lingered on her for a fraction too long. "To success," he concluded, raising his glass. The crowd echoed the toast, glasses raised high. But Ethan's focus was already elsewhere. He strode across the room, weaving between guests until he was standing directly in front of Claire. "You clean up well," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Claire's expression remained composed. "I wasn't aware this was a fashion contest." Ethan chuckled, his smirk widening. "Everything's a contest, Claire. Surely you've realized that by now." "Only for people who can't win without making it one," she replied smoothly, her tone clipped but professional. Ethan's smile faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly. "Touché. You've got a sharp tongue. But I wonder, how well does it hold up when everyone's watching?" Before she could respond, Ethan turned and gestured for her to follow. Conflicted, Claire hesitated for a moment before falling into step behind him. He led her to the center of the room, where the eyes of the crowd seemed to converge like heat-seeking missiles. Ethan turned to face her, his smile dazzling but laced with challenge. "Everyone," he began, his voice carrying with practiced ease. "I want to introduce you to Claire, one of the most talented staff members at my favorite restaurant. She's made quite the impression on me." The crowd murmured appreciatively, though the underlying current of condescension was palpable. Claire's spine stiffened, but she held her ground, her expression calm. Ethan leaned slightly closer, his voice soft but taunting. "Why don't you tell them a little about yourself?" Claire met his gaze, her eyes cold and unyielding. "What would you like to know, Mr. Kane?" "Oh, anything," Ethan said with a mockingly magnanimous wave. "What brought you here? What inspires you? Surely someone as intriguing as you has a story worth sharing." Claire felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, the room a sea of expectation and judgment. But instead of folding, she straightened her posture and allowed herself a faint smile. "My story isn't much different from anyone else's," she began, her voice steady. "I work hard. I take pride in what I do. And I don't take kindly to being used as a spectacle." The crowd's murmurs quieted, a ripple of discomfort spreading through the room. Ethan's smirk flickered, his composure cracking just enough for Claire to notice. "And you?" Claire asked, her tone calm but cutting. "What inspires you, Mr. Kane?" Besides attention, the room fell silent. Ethan's jaw tightened imperceptibly as the tension between them thickened. For the first time in a long while, he felt as though he were the one being sized up, his authority questioned in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I suppose you could say success inspires me," Ethan replied smoothly, though the edge in his voice betrayed him. "Building something from nothing. Taking risks." "Risks?" Claire echoed, tilting her head. "Is that what you call it?" Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what would you call it?" Claire stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "Taking advantage of people who can't fight back isn't risk. It's cruelty." Ethan's stomach tightened, though his expression didn't falter. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Claire turned and walked away, her steps unhurried, her chin held high. As the evening continued, Ethan found himself unable to focus. He circulated the room, engaging in polite conversation and pretending to enjoy the accolades he received from guests, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Claire. Her words echoed in his mind, sharp and unrelenting. For the first time, he felt truly outmaneuvered. Near the end of the night, as the last of the guests began to leave, Ethan caught sight of Claire near the exit. She was speaking quietly with another staff member, her expression unreadable. Without thinking, he approached her. "Leaving already?" he asked, his voice devoid of its usual smugness. Claire glanced at him, her face calm but distant. "My shift is over." Ethan hesitated, his usual confidence replaced by something unfamiliar. "You're good at this, you know," he said finally. "Not just the work. The game." Claire raised an eyebrow. "I didn't realize I was playing." Ethan chuckled, though it lacked its usual bite. "You always have an answer, don't you?" "I've had practice," she replied simply. As she walked away, Ethan felt a strange mix of frustration and admiration. Claire Matthews wasn't just a waitress. She was something else entirely, and for the first time, he began to wonder if he was the one being played. The following weeks blurred into a haze of frustration for Ethan Kane. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations and people alike, but Claire Matthews was proving to be an exception. Every interaction with her left him more intrigued, and yet no closer to understanding her. She was a riddle, each piece of her story deliberately hidden beneath layers he couldn't quite peel away. Ethan leaned against the glass wall of his penthouse one evening, staring at the glittering city below. On the table behind him lay the slim dossier his private investigator, Robert, had compiled on Claire. It was infuriatingly incomplete. Her life, on paper, seemed almost ordinary. A string of unremarkable jobs, a brief stint at university, and a current position at a high-end restaurant. But Ethan knew better. Ordinary people didn't carry themselves with the quiet confidence Claire exuded. Ordinary people didn't challenge him the way she did. He turned from the window, grabbed his phone, and dialed Robert's number. "This isn't enough," Ethan said the moment Robert answered. "There's something missing." Robert sighed audibly on the other end. "Ethan, I've told you, she's a ghost. No arrests, no lawsuits, no scandalous social media posts. Just a waitress with an attitude." Ethan's jaw tightened. People don't just exist without a trail. Dig deeper. Find out everything. Robert hesitated. "You're obsessed, Kane. Whatever she's hiding, is it worth this much trouble?" Ethan ended the call without answering, tossing the phone onto the couch. He didn't know why Claire's secrets mattered so much to him, but he couldn't let it go. There was a reason she intrigued him, and he was determined to find it. Claire, meanwhile, was aware that Ethan's curiosity had turned into an investigation. She could feel the shift in his demeanor during his now regular visits to the restaurant. His questions were more pointed, his stares longer, and his attempts at charm more deliberate. But Claire was prepared. She had anticipated his tactics from the start. One evening, as she cleared his table, Ethan leaned back in his chair and fixed her with a thoughtful gaze. "You know," he began, swirling the last remnants of his wine, "I've met a lot of people in my life. Some of them brilliant, some ambitious, most predictable. You're not like them." Claire glanced at him briefly before picking up his plate. "Should I be flattered?" "You should be curious," Ethan countered. "Most people want to be noticed. You seem determined not to be." Claire paused, turning her gaze to him fully for the first time that evening. "Maybe I've learned that attention isn't always a gift." Ethan's smirk faltered. "And yet you have mine." "Congratulations," she said dryly. "Should I applaud?" Ethan chuckled, though the sound lacked humor. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" Claire tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "I didn't realize I was supposed to." She walked away before he could respond, leaving Ethan to stew in his frustration. Her calm defiance was like a mirror, reflecting his own insecurities back at him. For the first time, he began to wonder if he had underestimated her completely. Later that week, Ethan's persistence began to pay off. A phone call from Robert yielded a tantalizing piece of information. Claire's father had been the owner of a small, now-defunct company. The business had collapsed years ago, swallowed up by a larger corporation in a hostile takeover. The name of that corporation? Kane Enterprises. Ethan's blood ran cold as he processed the revelation. It wasn't just a coincidence. Claire wasn't just a waitress. She was someone with a reason to despise him. "Get me everything on the acquisition," Ethan barked into the phone. "Every detail. Now." Over the next several days, Ethan pored over old files and records, piecing together the story. Claire's father, a man named Richard Matthews, had run a modest but profitable manufacturing business. Kane Enterprises had targeted the company during its expansion phase, using aggressive tactics to force a buyout. The deal had left Richard Matthews bankrupt and, according to an old news article, battling severe depression. The pieces began to fall into place. Claire's quiet strength, her refusal to be intimidated, her barely veiled contempt, it all made sense now. She wasn't just someone Ethan had wronged indirectly. She was the direct consequence of his ambition, a living reminder of the lives he had trampled on his way to the top. One evening, Ethan returned to the restaurant with a new determination. He had debated confronting Claire outright, but something held him back. He wanted answers, but more than that, he wanted to understand why she had hidden her identity from him. Claire approached his table, her expression as unreadable as ever. Before she could speak, Ethan gestured for her to sit. She hesitated but finally complied, her posture as poised as if she were the one in control. "Claire," Ethan began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Why didn't you tell me who you are?" Claire's brow furrowed slightly, but her composure remained intact. "I don't know what you mean." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Your father, Richard Matthews. The company my firm took over. You've known who I was this entire time, haven't you?" Claire's eyes narrowed, the faintest flicker of surprise breaking through her mask. But she quickly recovered, her lips pressing into a thin line. "So, you finally figured it out. Why?" Ethan asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and regret. "Why work here? Why interact with me at all?" Claire exhaled slowly, her gaze steady. "Because I wanted to see if you'd even remember. If you'd noticed the damage you caused without someone shoving it in your face." Ethan's stomach churned at her words. "I didn't know," he admitted quietly. "I didn't know about your father." Claire's laugh was bitter. "Of course you didn't. People like you never do. You look at numbers, not lives. You see opportunities, not consequences." Ethan wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the weight of her words silenced him. For the first time in years, he was forced to confront the human cost of his actions. As Claire stood to leave, she paused and looked back at him. "You asked why I didn't tell you who I was. The answer's simple. I wanted to see if you'd figure it out on your own. Turns out, even you can connect the dots." Eventually, she walked away, leaving Ethan alone at the table, the full weight of his past pressing down on him. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he could fix what he had broken. The days following Claire's revelation were a whirlwind for Ethan Kane. Her parting words echoed in his mind relentlessly, stripping away the armor of arrogance he had worn for years. Ethan, a man who thrived on control, was now grappling with a truth he couldn't manipulate or rationalize. He had built an empire on ambition, yet the foundation of his success was littered with lives like Claire's, people whose stories had been reduced to collateral damage. His penthouse, once a sanctuary of power and prestige, felt suffocating. The city skyline outside the massive windows seemed distant and indifferent, as if mocking his turmoil. Ethan poured himself a glass of whiskey and sank into the leather armchair in his living room. For the first time in years, the drink offered no solace. Across the city, Claire Matthews stood in the modest apartment she called home, staring at a stack of old documents spread across her dining table. Among them were faded photographs of her father, news clippings of Kane Enterprises' acquisition of his company, and handwritten notes that chronicled her father's final days before his death. The memories were a painful reminder of everything she and her family had lost. But alongside the pain was a quiet sense of victory. She had seen the flicker of guilt in Ethan's eyes. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Still, Claire knew she couldn't allow herself to feel complacent. Ethan was used to playing games, and she couldn't afford to underestimate him. She had spent years preparing for this moment, carefully constructing her strategy to confront the man who had unknowingly shaped her life. But the stakes were higher now. Ethan wasn't just a symbol of her family's downfall. He was a person, flawed and perhaps redeemable. And that made things infinitely more complicated. Ethan's first instinct was to fight back. He had spent his life conquering challenges, and part of him wanted to confront Claire, to discredit her accusations, to reassert control. But something about her demeanor, her quiet strength, her refusal to be cowed by him, had pierced through his defenses. Claire wasn't seeking revenge in the conventional sense. She wanted him to see the damage he had caused, to confront his actions in a way no business rival ever had. Determined to take the first step, Ethan reached out to Robert, his investigator. "I need you to find any other families impacted by that acquisition," he said, his tone grim. "Start with the employees of Matthews Manufacturing." Robert hesitated. "Are you planning damage control? Or something else?" "I'm planning to make things right," Ethan replied, though the words felt foreign even as he spoke them. The next day, Ethan arrived unannounced at the restaurant where Claire worked. She spotted him immediately as he strode across the dining room, his usual air of confidence tinged with something unfamiliar, hesitation. Claire met him at the host's stand, crossing her arms as she raised an eyebrow. "Back so soon?" she asked, her tone neutral but laced with skepticism. "I need to talk to you," Ethan said, his voice quieter than usual. "Not here. Somewhere private." Claire studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I have a break in 20 minutes. There's a cafe around the corner." When they sat across from each other at a small table in the cafe, Ethan looked more uncertain than Claire had ever seen him. For a moment, neither spoke. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. "I've started looking into what happened," Ethan began finally. "To your father's company, to the people who worked there." Claire leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. And what did you find? Ethan hesitated. The acquisition wasn't clean. We used aggressive tactics. Too aggressive. I didn't know at the time. I was delegating to my team, but that doesn't excuse it. Your father's company wasn't just a business. It was a livelihood for dozens of people, and I destroyed it. Claire's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, letting him continue. I've reached out to families who were impacted, Ethan said. I want to help, financially at least. I know it doesn't undo what happened, but it's a start. Claire's expression didn't soften. Do you think money fixes everything, Ethan? Do you think a check will erase the years of hardship, the humiliation, the pain of losing someone you love? Ethan's shoulders slumped. No, he admitted. I don't. But I have to start somewhere. For the first time, Claire saw a flicker of vulnerability in him. It wasn't the performative guilt of someone looking to save face. It was raw, unfiltered remorse. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but she couldn't deny that he was trying. I'm not doing this to ask for forgiveness, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that I'm listening. I hear you. Claire's grip on the edge of the table tightened. She had spent years waiting for this moment, for Ethan Kane to acknowledge the weight of his actions. But now that it was here, it didn't feel as satisfying as she had imagined. The anger was still there, but so was something else, an inkling of understanding that terrified her. In the days that followed, Ethan threw himself into the work of making amends. He met with former employees of Matthews Manufacturing, listening to their stories and offering restitution where he could. Some accepted his help reluctantly, while others refused outright, their resentment too deeply rooted to be soothed by his belated efforts. Each encounter chipped away at Ethan's confidence, forcing him to confront the reality of the man he had been. Meanwhile, Claire watched his transformation with cautious curiosity. She wasn't ready to trust him. Years of bitterness couldn't be undone in a matter of weeks, but she couldn't deny that he was changing. For the first time, Ethan Kane wasn't a faceless symbol of greed. He was a man struggling to reconcile his ambition with its consequences. One evening, Ethan returned to the cafe where he and Claire had spoken. He didn't tell her he was coming, but she arrived minutes after he did, as if she had been expecting him. I've been thinking about what you said, Ethan began when she sat down across from him, about how money can't fix everything. You're right, but it's all I've ever known. It's how I've measured success, how I've protected myself. And now I see that it's not enough. Claire studied him, her expression unreadable. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand, Ethan said. Not just what I'm doing, but why. I don't want to be that person anymore. The one who destroys without thinking, who wins at any cost. I want to be better. Claire exhaled slowly, her gaze softening just slightly. It's a long road, Ethan. And there's no guarantee you'll get there. I know, Ethan said, his voice resolute. But I'm willing to try. For the first time, Claire allowed herself to believe he might mean it. Ethan Kane had always believed in power, the power of wealth, influence, and strategy. But over the past weeks, his belief had been shaken. Claire Matthews had dismantled his worldview piece by piece, forcing him to see the cracks in the foundation he'd built his life upon. Every meeting with her was a challenge. Every word she spoke a quiet rebuke. Yet he couldn't bring himself to turn away. Something about her compelled him to stay, to listen, to try. It was a rainy evening when Ethan arrived unannounced at Claire's apartment. The address had been in the investigator's file, but he hadn't dared use it before now. Standing outside her door, he hesitated. The man who had walked into countless boardrooms and brokered billion-dollar deals was suddenly uncertain. With a deep breath, he knocked. Claire opened the door moments later, her expression shifting from surprise to guarded annoyance. She was dressed casually, sweatpants and a loose sweatshirt, but her posture remained as composed as ever. "What are you doing here?" she asked, crossing her arms. "I need to talk to you," Ethan said. "Please." For a long moment, Claire didn't respond. She seemed to weigh his words, her sharp eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. Finally, she stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. The apartment was small but tidy. the kind of place that spoke of practicality over indulgence. Ethan felt out of place amidst the modest furnishings, his tailored coat and expensive shoes starkly contrasting the worn carpet beneath his feet. Claire gestured for him to sit, but she remained standing, her arms crossed and her expression cool. "Well?" she prompted. "What's so urgent?" Ethan hesitated, the weight of what he was about to say settling heavily on his chest. "I've been looking into everything, your father's company, the acquisition, what happened afterward. I know now how much damage I caused. But there's something else, isn't there? Something you haven't told me." Claire's jaw tightened, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked truly vulnerable. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and her arms uncrossed as she let out a slow breath. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with a mix of anger and pain. "You think you've figured it all out, don't you?" she said, her voice low. "That because you've read some files and talked to a few people, you understand what you did?" Ethan's stomach churned, but he forced himself to hold her gaze. "I'm trying, Claire, but I know there's more." Claire moved to the small dining table, picking up a folder that had been sitting there. She hesitated for a moment before tossing it onto the table in front of him. "You want the truth? Read it." Ethan reached for the folder with trembling hands, opening it to reveal a collection of documents and photographs. His eyes scanned the first few pages: financial statements, eviction notices, medical bills. But it was a photograph near the back of the stack that stopped him cold. It was a sonogram. His eyes flicked back to Claire, who stood across the room, her arms wrapped around herself as though bracing for a storm. "I was pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When your acquisition destroyed my father's company, it didn't just take his life. It took my child." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. The words hit him like a physical blow, shattering whatever composure he had left. "Claire, I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," she said bitterly, "because you didn't care. You didn't look at the lives behind the numbers, the people who would pay the price for your ambition." Her voice cracked, but she pushed forward. "My father blamed himself for losing everything. He thought he'd failed us. And the stress, the grief, it broke him. And me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I lost my father, my child, and everything I had, while you thrived." Ethan's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white against the edges of the folder. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no words felt adequate. "I've spent years trying to rebuild my life," Claire continued, her voice trembling. "But no amount of work can erase what I lost. And now, after all this time, you show up with your guilt and your promises to make things right. Do you really think you can?" Ethan stood, his knees unsteady as he stepped closer to her. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice raw, "but I have to try. Not because I think it will fix anything, but because it's the only way I can live with myself." Claire's eyes burned into his, her pain and anger a palpable force between them. "Living with yourself isn't my problem, Ethan. It never was. The only thing I care about is that you understand what you did and never, ever do it again. I swear to you," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to undo the harm I've caused. Not just to you, but to everyone I've hurt." The silence that followed was heavy, the sound of rain against the window the only thing breaking it. Finally, Claire nodded, though the motion was small and hesitant. "Words are easy, Ethan," she said quietly. "Actions are harder. Show me." In the days that followed, Ethan threw himself into the work of restitution with a newfound sense of urgency. He didn't just write checks or issue apologies. He immersed himself in the lives of those his actions had affected. He set up trust funds for families, offered scholarships to displaced workers, and funded small businesses to replace those his acquisitions had destroyed. Claire watched his efforts from a distance, her emotions a storm of conflicting feelings. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but she couldn't deny the sincerity of his transformation. Ethan Kane was no longer the untouchable millionaire she had set out to confront. He was a man trying, stumbling, and failing, but refusing to stop. One evening, as Ethan sat in his penthouse, exhausted from another day of meetings and outreach, his phone buzzed with a message from Claire. You're starting to get it. Don't stop now. Ethan stared at the screen for a long time before replying. I won't. Ethan Kane's days had taken on a strange rhythm. Mornings were no longer filled with meetings about expansion or profit margins, but with conversations about rebuilding lives. His sleek penthouse office was now cluttered with files documenting restitution projects, each one a reminder of the destruction he had left in his wake. For the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't chasing power. He was chasing redemption. But the path was grueling. Many of the people he approached met him with skepticism or outright disdain. Some took his help reluctantly, unable to refuse the financial relief but unwilling to offer gratitude. Others refused entirely, slamming doors in his face or hanging up on his calls. Ethan accepted it all without argument. He didn't deserve forgiveness, and he wasn't sure he would ever earn it. Claire Matthews had been both distant and present throughout his journey. She wasn't there to guide him, nor did she offer encouragement, but her quiet observations were a constant reminder of why he had to keep going. Whenever Ethan faltered, her words rang in his ears. Actions are harder. Show me. It was a gray afternoon when Ethan found himself standing on the steps of a modest community center. The building was unassuming, its brick exterior worn but sturdy. Inside, former employees of Matthews Manufacturing were gathered for a reunion organized by Claire. She hadn't invited Ethan, but he had learned of it through his work with the families. As he entered, conversations quieted. Faces turned toward him, some hostile, others curious. Ethan felt the weight of their stares, but forced himself to move forward. Claire was standing near the back, speaking with an older man who looked vaguely familiar. When she noticed Ethan, her expression didn't change, but her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite decipher. "What are you doing here?" she asked when he approached. "I came to listen," Ethan replied simply, "and to learn." Claire studied him for a moment before stepping aside. "Then listen." Ethan spent the next 2 hours hearing stories that left him hollow. Former employees shared tales of losing their homes, their savings, their families. Each story was a dagger, cutting deeper into his sense of self. When it was over, he stood in front of the group, the weight of their pain pressing down on him. "I can't undo what I've done," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his throat. "I can't bring back what was lost, but I can promise you this. I will spend the rest of my life trying to make things better, not just for you, but for anyone who's been hurt by people like me." A heavy silence followed his words. Then, slowly, an older woman in the back spoke. "Talk's cheap, Mr. Kane. We'll see if you mean it." Ethan nodded. "You will." As the months passed, Ethan's efforts began to yield results. The Matthews Foundation, which Claire had quietly managed for years, became a prominent force in supporting displaced workers, thanks to Ethan's financial backing and advocacy. Small businesses were thriving again, and families who had struggled for years were beginning to rebuild. But Ethan's greatest challenge remained earning Claire's trust. Claire had softened slightly toward him, though she remained guarded. They met occasionally to discuss the foundation's progress, their conversations growing less formal with time. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, Claire surprised Ethan by inviting him for a drink. "I don't usually drink with former adversaries," she said, setting 2 glasses on her kitchen table. "But I guess you've earned it." Ethan raised his glass, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'll take that as a compliment." They talked for hours, their conversation drifting from work to personal stories. Claire shared memories of her father, his sense of humor, his dedication to his family. Ethan listened intently, offering no excuses for his role in her pain, but acknowledging it with quiet sincerity. As the evening wore on, Claire leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "You've changed, Ethan. I didn't think it was possible, but you've proven me wrong." Ethan looked down at his glass, turning it slowly in his hands. "I'm not the same man I was, but I still have a lot to prove. To you, to myself." Claire nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Maybe you're starting to." The turning point came one crisp autumn morning when Claire received a phone call from a local news outlet. They had learned of Ethan's efforts and wanted to run a feature on the Matthews Foundation and its partnership with Kane Enterprises. Claire hesitated, unsure of whether to involve Ethan in the spotlight. But when she called him to discuss it, his response surprised her. "This isn't about me," Ethan said firmly. "If it helps the foundation and the people we're supporting, I'll do whatever it takes. But I don't want credit for something I should have done years ago." Claire was quiet for a moment. "That's unexpected." Ethan chuckled softly. "I've learned a few things along the way. The feature was a success, bringing much-needed attention and funding to the foundation. For the first time, Claire allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope, not just for the foundation, but for Ethan. He was no longer the man who had walked into the restaurant months ago with arrogance and entitlement. He was someone she could begin to trust. It was a cold winter evening when Ethan finally asked Claire the question he had been holding back for weeks. They were walking through a quiet park after a meeting, the snow crunching under their feet. "Claire," he began, his voice hesitant, "do you think you could ever forgive me?" Claire stopped walking, her breath visible in the frosty air. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she admitted. "Forgiveness isn't easy. It's not something you just decide to give. It has to be earned." Ethan nodded, his shoulders heavy with the weight of her words. "I understand." "But," Claire continued, her voice softer, "you've come a long way. And maybe someday, I'll be ready." Ethan felt a faint glimmer of hope. "That's more than I deserve." Claire smiled faintly, the first genuine smile she had ever given him. "Maybe, but it's a start." As the weeks turned into months, Ethan and Claire's relationship evolved. What had started as a confrontation became a partnership and eventually something resembling friendship. They worked together to expand the foundation's reach, their shared purpose creating a bond neither had anticipated. Ethan Kane had spent his life building an empire, but in the end, it was the destruction of that empire and the people he met along the way that truly shaped him. And Claire Matthews, who had once been his harshest critic, became the person who showed him the path to redemption.